Hello and welcome to the second webinar in a series of 5 for Elemental on the indoor climate emergency, impacting air quality, heating, cooling, health and well-being in the built environment. My name is Jim McClelland. I'm the founder and editor of SustMeme, home to both the magazine and the top 500 rankings. Today's session is on future scenarios for a warming world. So with sales of aircon booming to tackle rising temperatures, we'll explore what this means for design and engineering, installation, innovation, indoor air quality and the carbon footprint of building stock, plus the challenges of retrofit, all in around 30 minutes with Q&A to follow. We will ask the question, are we facing an indoor climate emergency? The whole webinar series is being hosted and produced by Elemental, www.elementalexpo.com, the online community for professionals focused on innovation in heat, water, air and energy, the vital elements within the built environment now and in the future. You'll find the full diary of events on the website, including the next 3 webinars in this series on air tightness and ventilation, well-being, and finally, health. You can also view the first webinar on demand, discussing going back to work in buildings post-COVID. Some great speakers in every session, including the 3 joining me on screen here today, namely David Fries, Group Chief Executive at BISA, Claire Holman, Senior Research Associate, Energy Institute, UCL, leading IAQM Indoor Air Quality Work and Director, Brook Cottage Consultants, plus Hugh Blackwell, Principal Associate and Thesis. By way of very brief intro for our topic, most of us, I think, are familiar with the idea of climate emergency by now. David Attenborough, Greta Thunberg, Extinction Rebellion, wildfires from California to Australia, floods from Vietnam to Wales, from 400 parts per million to 4 degrees. We're also regularly told that the built environment and construction are responsible for towards, say, 40% of total carbon emissions in the UK. Our focus today is on what happens indoors and how that increasingly is affecting those scenarios outdoors and on the role of the built environment. In other words, in a world of greater temperature fluctuations and extremes, demand for cooling and heating is on the rise, fueled by urbanisation and economic development. Ventilation, air quality are becoming hot topics, pun intended, as homes and offices battle with indoor environment issues from comfort, productivity, carbon footprints to go, all included. This is the indoor climate emergency. So let's zoom in on the issues and bring in our panel. As we consider future low to zero carbon scenarios for a warming world, from aircon to air quality, retrofit to footprints, I'd like to start by asking each of our panelists to introduce themselves and give us their take on the state of play and the priorities at present. So briefly, who are you? Where do you fit into the puzzle? What's your view on the indoor climate and environment emergency? So first, the perspective of a representative body. David.
Hi, Jim. Thank you for that intro. My name is David Fries and I'm Chief Executive of BISA, which is the Building Engineering Services Association. So we represent the major contractors who do M&E, or building services. And in this scenario, if we were to say they do ventilation systems in particular, then that would fit into the air quality piece. We have about 1,000 members and represent the majority of turnover in this area. And we publish technical documents and also do apprenticeships and that sort of thing. From our perspective, we think pretty much everything is linked. And for years, we've been arguing that buildings are not being built properly. The tell has always been the performance gap, where the average building uses around about 200% more energy than the design intent. And our argument is that it's almost impossible to build poorly just for energy consumption. If it's out on energy, it's crap on everything. And the holes that the energy gets out of are the holes that the fire and smoke get through. And we were arguing that. I've been doing it for probably 10 or 15 years, and little did I know that we would end up with Grenfell, which is the ultimate scenario of badly built coming back to bite us. And then, of course, we had the Hackett Review and everything that brings that into Building Safety Act. And the reason we're here is, I think, that as an industry, we assemble products. We don't treat the building as a product and a holistic system. It's a series of assembled products that look like the thing we put in for planning. And my fear out of the Building Safety Act and other bits is that we end up focusing on building safety, making it safe for fire. And when we do that, we'll end up in 5–10 years' time and say, hang on, we've got health problems now in buildings because we poorly ventilate them. We've forgotten that piece because we've only focused on one element. And our argument would be that if you build it correctly, if you build it to the requirements for design on energy and carbon and safety, then it will be intrinsically safe rather than build it to be safe. What we effectively do as an industry is we always say there's a problem and then try and solve the problem without actually getting to what's the disease. And the disease is very clearly that we don't build the thing we said we were going to build. And therefore, I would always come at, if you want to deal with any element, and indoor air quality would be part of that, start by building properly in the first place. And you can transpose that into all kinds of areas. Smart cities is a classic. Well, if you want a smart city, start with a smart building. And at the moment, none of us can say that our buildings are particularly smart. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, lots of issues in play there. And as a sustainability person, it is that joining up. It is the whole greater than sum of the parts. And although we talk about that, there's a lot of single issue politics. Sustainability space, it can be carbon, although that's critical. It's not the only game in town, and there are unintended consequences if that is exclusively your focus. So Hugh, as a consultant and an energy specialist, your take, please.
Thank you, Jim. Yes, so the indoor climate and the environment emergency. So first of all, a quick introduction myself. My name is Hugh Blackwell. I work for a company called Anthesis. I specialize, Anthesis does all forms of sustainability, but my particular subject matter expertise, as Jim was talking about, is energy and specializing in low carbon and renewable heating systems, all the way up to big district heating schemes. And in terms of the indoor climate and the climate emergency, we are doing a number of modelling exercises determining pathways for policy for various local authorities and private organisations. And what is quite clear when you start working on that is for anything to do with new build, we've got to be very rapidly moving to close to something like net zero operational carbon operations within new build. And actually ventilation is quite a key element of this, because we have to build tight, to build things airtight, as David was mentioning, but we've also got to ventilate right. And the requirement to ventilate right has become none more apparent than with the COVID crisis that is upon us now. And actually, ventilation has a disproportionate impact on energy consumption. There are studies out there showing that actually you're better off making things more airtight than putting even more insulation on the outside of a building. There is a better cost benefit in getting the ventilation right. And that is all required to achieve us to get to 2050 targets. People are talking about 2030 targets in a climate emergency. It becomes even more pressing there because the real issue is actually our existing buildings. 85% of the buildings that are expected to be out there in 2050 are already with us now, and an awful lot of them are not properly ventilated. It is quite common when we go and do building surveys, for example, to find people stuffing newspaper or fabric or things of that nature into ventilation systems to stop ventilation air coming in, because it's perceived as an energy loss. It's a waste of energy. It's a leaking of energy, rather than understanding what that the function of those particular aspects are. So really, when it comes to the climate emergency, the indoor climate, the really big challenge is actually all our existing stock, even not discounting the quite considerable challenge of dealing with our new build assets going forward. That's my perspective, Jim.
Excellent, excellent. Thank you, Hugh. Yes, and retrofitting existing stock is undoubtedly something we'll be coming back to. I mean, in truth, given the targets we're looking at, we wouldn't choose to start from where we are on the map with the stock we have. but it is where we are on the map. And so we have to work with all those assets you've already described, which are poor functioning, and also a lack of understanding on the part of some of the occupants and owners to boot, which is worsening the scenario potentially. So Claire, as an indoor air quality expert, your take, please.
Okay, so my name's Claire Holman. I chair the Institute of Air Quality Management's indoor air quality group. So I am an air quality consultant, having spent many years working on the outdoor environment, but increasingly myself and my colleagues are moving indoors because that's where the emphasis is now. We do, of course, spend most of our time indoors, maybe 80 or 90% of our time, and therefore the exposure people have indoors is much longer than the exposure you have outdoors. And especially in recent months with the COVID pandemic, we're spending a lot more time indoors than we have previously. Even people who are working from, either they're working from home, they're commuting less, even if were previously going to offices, they were indoors, but they are actually spending more time overall inside. So what is the issue in terms of indoor air quality? There is very little regulation about the concentrations that we're exposed to indoors. Yeah. For new build and major renovation, we have the Part F of the building regs. That is all a bit vague as to whether or not the standards which are mentioned in there should be achieved or not. It's not mandatory. They're very out of date, those standards. They talk about lead ingressing from outside. Lead pollution went out many years ago. We stopped having leaded petrol. It started to be phased out, I think, from 1986. Things haven't moved on. Maybe this is because the people who normally write the approved documents are not air quality specialists and therefore don't realize that things have actually changed over time. So we also have, we have the issue of the ingress of outdoor air pollution into the buildings, but that is not the only issue. We have sources of air pollution inside, and often the concentrations of the pollutants are higher inside than they are outdoors. And yet the only regulations we really have are the worker exposure limits. And those worker exposure limits were designed really for the industrial setting. For many of the pollutants that we're concerned about, the worker exposure limits are orders of magnitude higher than the ambient air quality limits. And in many work environments, there are people who are vulnerable. So it might be that people have pre-existing health problems, but they're still working. It might be pregnant women. It might be the elderly who are living in a care home. They are still covered under the health and safety at work regulations. And so we have this rather strange situation where we have no direct regulation controlling public exposure inside. We have regulations outside, but the worker exposure limits, which is the only thing that applies indoors, are much higher than those that apply outdoors, and we spend more time indoors. I mean, we are in a really bizarre situation. So I think that there's beginning to be recognition of this issue. Public Health England at the end of last year published some air quality guidelines for particular volatile organic compounds for the first time. So I think that's where I'm really coming from, is that, you know, we need to look at indoor air quality and we need to start improving it. And I think I'll finish there. Thank you.
Okay. Yeah, well, I think you may get some of what you want thanks inadvertently to COVID, in that obviously it's changed our focus on these matters and it may accelerate change and uptake. I also think, strangely, that it is one of those issues about which consumers and the general public do get quite excited. You know, they understand air quality, usually in terms of pollution outdoors, but they also understand a little bit about off-gassing indoors and things like that. So there is consumer interest in terms of the health and well-being debate, but it doesn't seem to be translating into professional circles and standards and regulations yet. But let's hope that's about to change. So looking, if you like, at some of the problems that we're facing, I'd like to ask a few questions around risk and responsibility now, effectively, in that zoom in on the specifics. There's a range of risk scenarios over time, and I wanted to discuss the responsibilities of the built environment sector in mitigating and tackling them. In other words, what are the problems and whose job is it to fix them? So I'd like to really dig deep here and be candid about where we are and what we're dealing with. So Hugh, how will a climate-fueled clamour for heating and cooling impact our chances of hitting carbon reduction and net zero targets, and who should be leading on demanding and delivering the sustainable solutions? Please.
Well, there is no doubting what was said previously, I think by David, in that the need for heating and cooling have a very major impact in terms of carbon emissions, and actually often disproportionately over what many members of the general public may estimate. Increasingly, with the decarbonisation of electricity in the UK, what is beginning to dominate carbon emissions and carbon emission discussions is gas consumption. And the major use of gas consumption in the UK is heating for homes and heating for businesses. And actually, in some ways, again, referring back to the current situation with COVID, what we're potentially even seeing is a change even there, meaning that even more so, heating is becoming potentially a home issue in some respects, because as working from home increases, people are potentially looking at heating those spaces for longer compared to alternative scenarios. So, and really, in terms of getting to our carbon reduction net zero targets, there is already a statutory requirement to get to net zero carbon by 2050. It's actually quite a recent one that came in June last year, but the government has made a legal obligation to get there, and we do not achieve it without tackling the requirement for decarbonising heating and, to a certain extent, cooling. And it is a very large task with potential policy hazards along the way. Now, what is happening at the moment is, because electricity is decarbonised, we're very much at a tipping point whereby people are focusing much more on electric heating solutions, typically using things like heat pumps. And actually in commercial buildings, that becomes quite a natural focus to actually, well, I've already got a piece of cooling plant, it's a refrigeration machinery. Relatively minor design changes mean that where you have that asset starts becoming your heating solution for half the year and your cooling solution for half the year. And that is a way of addressing some of this, is of reducing carbon and trying to get to those kind of net zero carbon targets. But that's very much becoming a focus. It doesn't solve it, because electricity still isn't zero carbon and is not expected to become zero carbon for a long time, but it can give us a big step change. However, there are hazards lying around there. There is probably not electricity supply to meet all of our heating needs without substantial extension of the national grid and generation on the national grid. And carbon dioxide is not the only regulated emission. Actually, under the law, there are about 6 emissions, and 5 of those are, generally speaking, associated with energy production, including hydrofluorocarbons, which are the refrigerants typically found in refrigeration systems, so heat pumps and air conditioning, and a gas called sulfur hexafluoride, which is typically used as an electrical insulator in switchgear. So there is a real challenge as well in terms of trying to scoop up all the requirements around here with heating and cooling systems, particularly with these kind of refrigeration systems, because we can unintentionally drive other global warming effects through wider deployment of refrigeration and wider electrification of systems if we are not careful. And there is already some precedent of this. So it's quite a complex area, but there are a lot of tipping points happening at once. Some of the refrigerant sides, for example, is being regulated out under a thing called the Kigali Agreement. That's leading to changes in the refrigerant market, changes in refrigerants, and those refrigerants themselves have got other risks that people aren't used to with traditional systems. So we're moving back into things which have potentially a health impact in terms of toxicity or a flammability risk. and those need managing. It's not that it's a stop to that solution, but they do need managing, and that is a change from where we currently are in terms of our design. So what I think this is going to lead us to have is more water-based heating and cooling systems, to try and get to the carbon reduction and net zero targets, and more focus on waste heat. But there is no silver bullet to this. There needs to be a lot of different solutions. The second part to your question was who is leading on demanding delivery?
Yeah, I could suggest perhaps either who is leading, or you could even highlight a party that has failed or yet come to the table adequately. So I'm looking for who could make the biggest difference. So either who should lead, or who should wake up to the scenario and leverage their muscle, as it were, to help change happen. So I wonder if you could just pick an influential party that can bring about some of the positives to fix the problems you described.
Well, I'm just going to focus on what I think is another very interesting tipping point we might be getting to. And that is that net zero is now becoming a key focus for business. And we do things like science-based targets for individual organizations and things of that nature. There is a lot of interest around business becoming net zero. And certain things such as photovoltaic generation on buildings, we're now talking about subsidy-free renewables with that type of technology. They're very much, again, on the cusp of becoming the point whereby, well, why would you invest in a fossil system if the equivalent zero carbon system is cost equivalent, or dare I say, maybe getting to the point where it's going to be lower cost. And it's a very tantalizing prospect. But if we move to the point where the net zero, or even just the low carbon solution, is the more economic solution anyway, I think we could see some very rapid changes from the likes of big business, the likes of investment portfolio, where investment portfolios are looking to invest their money, which leads to a kind of a snowballing effect and a big change, which is perhaps a little bit different from kind of the conventional interventions that people are talking about in terms of government stepping in, government subsidy, things of that nature. So that's where I'd like to put there as a slightly controversial point on terms of who might lead and demand and deliver some of this going forward.
That's a nice point. And in terms of making the business case, there's no clearer indicator, I don't think, than if you just follow the money. The investment community is, with green finance and ESG and various financial mechanisms, is absolutely steering the ship, regardless of some of central government policy in different parts of the world. So, Claire, I think you touched on some of this already, but if I challenge you, why is indoor air quality not a performance metric for success or failure in new build and retrofit environments for living and working already? Why is it not already a key performance metric?
It is not easy, that's why, because we're not talking about one pollutant, we're talking about a lot of different pollutants. So if you were to require somebody who was building a new house to actually measure the whole raft of pollutants that might be present, it would be very costly. Hugh mentioned the decarbonisation agenda, and one good thing if we move more towards use of electricity in buildings is that we won't have the emissions from gas appliances. So gas appliances give rise to nitrogen dioxide and carbon monoxide in the house. So that is a good thing for air quality. But in terms of new build, then as I mentioned before, Part F of the building regulations is where it is mentioned but not really controlled. It has to, I don't think you can have indoor air quality standards for the private home. You can have it for new builds and major refurbishment at that point. But if you were actually to say, well, every home has to meet a certain standard, I do not believe that the UK public would accept that interference in their private lives. It would actually ban them from smoking apart from anything else. I remember a long time ago, my husband did a study about lead pollution, and they found one person had a particularly high concentration of lead in his blood, and that was because he was smelting lead on his open fire. Now, this was a long time ago, but you know, people do things that you don't expect in their own private home, and in a way that is sort of up to them, as long as they understand the risks of what they're doing. So I think the new build is the point at which it should, or major refurbishment is the point where these standards should apply. I agree totally with David about this issue about design specifications and how the buildings are built. I think we have a huge issue in this country about the quality of new buildings. But that's not an air quality issue. That is just a generic building issue, but it is something that has to be resolved. I do think there should be standards in the building regs. I think we need to find clever and easy and cost-effective ways of measuring those pollutants. And I'm not quite sure that we're there yet. The current building regs, part F, talk about total VOCs. I'm not sure total VOCs is an adequate indicator of anything, because it doesn't mean anything, because it's the individual pollutants that cause the health effects, not the total number of VOCs. But again, we need to find some key species, key chemicals that we need to actually put into those specifications. So we don't actually say to people, you've got to measure absolutely everything. And it might be that carbon dioxide has always traditionally been considered an indicator pollutant, although if it's ingress of air from outside that's causing the problem, then it's not a good indicator of nitrogen dioxide. So it's not always, doesn't always work. So I think there needs to be some guidance about when different indicators might be appropriate. But I think we need to, I mean, I would like part F to be actually called an indoor air quality approved document rather than ventilation, because I think that's the end point. That's what we're trying to get to. You know, the ventilation is the means of getting there. But on the other hand, the building profession know about ventilation. They're familiar with the word ventilation, they're less familiar with the word air quality, and we don't want to scare people. So it's trying to find the right metrics that would adequately protect people, and that's not easy.
Absolutely. And if I think you touched on the lack of standards, but going forward, the impact of COVID on with a focus on health and well-being, I just wonder, do you think it'll actually drive standards up, or will it just lead to tighter regulation and compliance? In other words, more businesses and parties covering themselves more closely. So will standards go up, or will they just be adhered to more tightly?
Well, we don't have the standards at the moment. Outdoor, we know there's a relationship between air pollution and COVID. It looks like, well, the evidence is emerging. It's probably not enough evidence yet. But if you think about it, the health effects of air pollution are, it causes and exacerbates those very diseases that are the diseases that COVID is particularly attacking. So if you've got, say, for example, particulate matter, small fine particles can cause diabetes. Diabetes is one of the diseases that are particularly, people with it are particularly sensitive to the virus. So, you know, it seems to be sensible to think there probably is a correlation between the two. And I think that the awareness of the public is growing and growing. And I do hope, and I think it will happen, is that there will be growing concern about indoor air quality when we're well past this pandemic.
Absolutely.
But the future is always difficult to predict.
Isn't it just? But I do think actually in the pandemic we're going to understand phrases like excess deaths. And of course, the air pollution people have been talking about 40,000 excess deaths a year through air pollution, you know, and we're talking about some of those numbers in pandemic terms. Well, we've had that pollution pandemic, if you like, for years and years in this country, and failed to recognize it. So David, all the above concerns, they're not always evident in design and engineering specifications. They're not always driving industry innovation and smart tech. Why not? Why are all these obvious concerns not driving how industry does its business?
I think, well, often we're under the misapprehension that the client's after a building. They're not always, in fact, in many cases they're not. They're after an investment vehicle. And an investment vehicle requires a return on investment and therefore has to be built on time, on budget, on spec. Except the on spec bit is optional, because nobody gets prosecuted for a failure to comply. And I get your point. I think one of the drivers of that change will be funders of projects through the ESG requirements, as you were discussing, because I believe it's the client who has to drive this process, as identified by Hackett, who said that the clients are responsible and they need to feel that responsibility. And once you get them feeling the responsibility, then it starts to drive behaviors down the supply chain and across the piece. All they have to do is deliver the thing they put in for planning, not a facsimile of it, i.e. a number of assembled products that look like the thing they put in for planning, but actually the thing that put in for planning. And it also requires us to care. You have to care about the outcome. And I think too few people who are in that key elements of it don't care, and therefore you end up with this dreadful value engineering, which has no value, no engineering. But once the basics are in place, everything else will fall into place, I think, because there is a presumption of compliance. And we've been listening to the alternative for weeks and weeks and weeks at the Grenfell inquiry, where nobody appeared to be responsible, and value engineering was the thing that seemed to drive everything. But once you have a presumption of compliance, then companies have certainty of design, as opposed to building design, which is disastrous on every sense. And therefore you have less risk, less variables, and dare I say it, people make profits. And they can see they are going to make profit because there is a very clear thing they have to achieve, and they achieve it. And the client gets the building they want. When you make profit, you can invest back into technology, innovation, skills, all of the things that make for better buildings. So you end up with this virtuous circle. I think that's the key bit. If you start to build the thing you said you would build, then you can focus on other elements. So you're quite right. Clients don't buy ductwork. They buy clean air. They buy certain, rates. They buy all of those things. They don't buy wind and tin, which is what we call fans and tin. They buy the air, the clean air. And therefore, that's the element we should be fixing on. If you deliver a building properly, the other elements fall into place, and you'll have proper filtration, you'll have proper air quality. So that's our view.
And in some cases, if we're talking about the economics of it, and you're maybe pricing in some externalities and, as it were, pricing out pollution to get a better return on some of the more sustainable intentions, if you like. If we're moving into this greener future of delivering better against what we're hoping for, is there actually the resource and the talent in the building services sector to respond to that emerging agenda? Are there the people? Is there the training? Are there the skills? Is it there in place, David, to respond to these perhaps more ambitious approaches?
I think there are people within it who have the skill set to deliver. There aren't enough, because in too many cases it doesn't really matter. The sad fact in the industry is that the fact you can't do a job has never stopped you winning a job in building services. and it's just a fact, isn't it? And once we get to a position where you have to evidence that you are both competent and compliant, that will drive people into getting the evidence of their competence, compliance. And I think we're at a period now where we are going to see a massive supercharge of new skills requirements. So digital construction bits just had a huge boost. Ventilation just had a huge boost. It's gone from being the Cinderella industry, the above the ceiling that nobody cares about, to, hey, this is quite important. Who knew? Who could have considered that ventilation would be important? And it's gone from being do what you want with it because it's above the ceiling, I can't see it, to actually we need to make sure we get this right. And therefore, how do you guarantee you're going to get this right? Well, you make sure that you are employing, or you are using companies who have demonstrated and evidence that they are competent to do this work. Why wouldn't you do that? But only if you are held responsible for the outcome of the building. Excellent.
So once you start to value outcome, you will be investing in the process and the necessary people back. perhaps.
Yeah, it's a holistic approach. Every bit is integrated. You can't just put a sticking plaster over one bit and say we've cured it. You've dealt with the symptom, not the disease.
Absolutely. Well, that segues nicely perhaps into my third round of questions before a bit of Q&A. Is we're looking at really transitioning from built environment being part of the problem, the old cliche, to becoming part of the solution. So I'd like us to focus on the positives in prospect, the lessons to be learned. So an uplifting finale from us all, if you like. How can we actually build back better in the wake of a great green reset? How might we turn the indoor climate emergency into a triumph of sustainable best practice? Maybe. So roast into spectacles on. Claire, IEQ, what could success look like for the indoor environment quality?
Well, that is an incredibly difficult question. We're right at the beginnings of indoor air quality. There's much that we do not know, although the government is putting lots of money into research into the issue, which is good. I wanted to pick up on a few things that David talked about. He talked about value engineering, and I do think that is the curse of the building business. Because value engineering is not value engineering. And as he said, it's the value, not the engineering, that comes into it. So I think that is something that really has to be addressed, and it covers all the issues. In terms of indoor air quality, I mean, I've already said that I think that the approved document F should be called indoor air quality and not ventilation, which is sort of what David was saying. But I also think we need a holistic approach, because the indoor environment is not just about air quality, it's about noise, it's about overheating, etc., etc. So we need to look at these things together, but we need to ensure that none of the issues are treated as Cinderella issues, as ventilation was many years ago, because they're all equally important. And how do you balance the trade-offs between saving energy and reducing air tightness, not increasing air tightness, I mean. It's, you know, air quality has really suffered over the last few years because climate change has become the big issue since probably about the year 2000. So we've had 20 years where one issue has become predominant over another. They are all equally important. So it's how you could actually get a holistic approach to this issue without anybody becoming the Cinderella issue. And I think that's the way forward. But really, the government has got to take the lead on this. If the government doesn't take the lead on it, I don't believe anything will happen.
Fair point. And I think actually, although we'll have to wait and see how things pan out post-pandemic, I do think it has put an awful lot of the social and people sustainability issues back on the agenda that really weren't there, and therefore well-being, health and people issues and the ethics of things, as well as climate and carbon and environment. So I think there's been a slight rebalancing, but it remains to be seen whether that persists, I guess. David, my question to you is, rather than televised, if the future is going to be engineered, is it? And if so, how?
Well, let's look at what's the prize here. So picking up on Claire's point, I think something like 90% of people spend 90% of their time in a building. And therefore, that has huge social impact. In the days when £1 billion was an awful lot of money, the NHS spent £1.4 million a year on bad health outcomes from poor housing, which is a shocking figure in this century that we're dealing with health outcomes from bad housing. And technology is the answer. And this stuff, again, as Claire said, it's difficult. It's really difficult and it's technical. And therefore you have to invest in the skills of the future, and you have to invest in the technology to make these things work. But if you do that, then there's so much societal benefit, both physical and mental well-being and health of the nation. You could start to stop people getting ill and then treating them. Don't make sure they don't get ill. And the notion of the building as a safe haven. So 90% of your time in a building, why wouldn't it be a safe haven? Why would you go in a building and end up being poisoned by the building? So it's worse than outside air. There are a couple of interesting things, and I find this a lot with architects, around natural ventilation and, we say, forced ventilation. And there seems to be this notion that somehow natural ventilation is somehow organic air. And as soon as you stick air through a filter and a fan, it suddenly becomes genetically modified and somehow unwholesome. And we've got to get rid of that, because actually you've got to filter stuff, basically. That's it. But not only then can this safe haven tackle the health and well-being of the people living it, but it also helps us deal with climate change and the climate crisis. And also the spread of disease. You know, we've learned that from COVID. And if COVID is nothing else, it's a kind of a warning to the world that actually this is what climate change is going to be like. You need to be facing up to it now. This is what climate change is going to be like, but probably 1,000,000 times worse. So it's a win-win-win. If you get buildings right, you make them safe, you have a better society. To do that, we've got to stop assembling products, start thinking of a building as a system, and then we'll make progress.
Good point. And I always think if budgets in government weren't in silos, if the health budget was reallocated to some of the causes of the problems, and all manner of health issues in more deprived areas, and where housing is a problem, and where access to appropriate food, where pollution, etc. If we were to try and allocate some of that spend, which is enormous, the health budget is massive in all its forms, then some of the monies we're talking about in terms of where people live and how people have access to services and things would radically be more doable, I feel. But that's a whole.
But again, that's the sticking plaster over the symptom, ironic as it is for the health service, rather than the disease. But government policy is like that, isn't it? Yep. You know, they delegate responsibility for air pollution to local authorities, like air pollution follows these neat little local authority boundaries. Of course it doesn't. So it's not critical to allocate the money on that basis.
It stops at the borough board.
We undermine what schemes they do bring. So,
and lastly then, Hugh, I've got a sort of cheeky question for you to finish on, if you like. What will inspire real estate to get excited about ventilation? So, how are you going to sell ventilation as sexy to property real estate?
Well, I'm going to come at this from, maybe 2 or 3 perspectives. Number one, I'm going to start off from, the climate emergency and net zero carbon perspective. If you're working in real estate, as I work in real estate and construction, we want to be working in this going forward. There is no future where there is no future construction. If we just stop development, there is no ongoing improvement. You fix things, and because of nature of entropy, you just effectively letting things degrade. So what does the future of the industry look like, especially if we're in types of a world to do with real development and real estate? Really, if we're looking at the net zero carbon argument and the climate emergency, we're taking that seriously, and even just complying with the law, we're looking out to 2050. There's a statutory requirement to tackle some of this. In the future of real estate, you don't really have a future if you're not seriously dealing and planning with what you are going to do within your own area of responsibility to respond to climate change. And I think we've already seen this. I mentioned earlier on how businesses are potentially the ones who might start becoming the leaders on this, but there is now very big named entities, funding bodies and things of that nature are very actively thinking about this within their investment timeframes and taking action about it, and doing things like divesting investments away from people who are not taking this seriously. So how does this link to ventilation? Well, it was kind of touched on by touched on by David. Why is real estate going to get excited with ventilation? Because of net zero carbon. And the basic answer is, to get to net zero carbon targets, all new build is going to need to get very close to that in terms of operations. And you cannot do that without you can only do that with the current technology without using mechanical ventilation or forced ventilation, or however you want to term it. And there is a misunderstanding around this natural ventilation terminology. It's not that natural ventilation is bad, and it's not that it's not going to take be the solution in certain scenarios. However, if you want controlled and a controlled environment, and you do not want to be wasteful of energy, you probably are going to need a mechanical ventilation system, because the nature of natural ventilation is it's effectively over-engineered to spill air out into the outside environment, and across most time frames, to allow a minimum ventilation when there's very little air movement outside. And the only way to actually deal with that and make it more efficient is a mechanical system, and with things like heat recovery. So in new build and even all the retrofits, what we are probably going to be looking at is ventilation more and more. And as I mentioned, as you make a building more airtight, ventilation is actually the more cost-effective way to do this than adding yet more and more insulation to a building. You know, if you look at going towards passive house kind of standards, it's more cost-effective to improve the ventilation than to keep on putting insulation on the building, and that's very interesting. My final point in terms of why might real estate to get excited about ventilation, just to bring it right back to the current time frame as well. What COVID has actually made is everyone has had to go and do a risk assessment of their ventilation system, where they're looking for people to occupy it as a place of work. And that brings up the tantalizing prospect. You know, if you go and look at risk assess your ventilation system, and it's not compliant, then potentially your space can't be occupied. So we've already got this real estate crisis. You know, all of a sudden offices around the world are empty, people are working from home. If you own that type of real estate, you need to be bringing people back in. And if you're a responsible organization, that has meant you've got to go and risk assess your ventilation, and the stuff that passes the risk assessment is occupiable again. The other stuff is potentially you've got the opportunity of that becoming something more like a stranded asset until you resolve it. And you know, even in current terms, or even if you're talking about future planning to mitigate risks of future pandemics, well, it seems that ventilation is going to be very much part of the key of that, and getting it right is going to give you more resilience as a business going forward. And that's a very current reason maybe to get a bit more excited about ventilation than has historically been the case.
Absolutely, that future-proofing cell, I think, is very valuable for a range of solutions and technologies, and takes us nicely then to open matters up to the virtual floor with our live Q&A. Keep those questions coming. I think I said on social media, you pose them, I'll ask them. David, Claire, and Hugh will answer them. And I'm struggling to drop the TH each time there. So we have a few here. So I have one from Nathan Gambler for you, Claire. It says, can Claire see a separate trade being engendered from all this, which solely concentrates on the installation of mechanical balance ventilation heat recovery systems, MVHR? Can you see a separate trade coming out of all this?
I have no idea why that's been addressed to me. I would have thought it was more a question for David.
Well, we can maybe come to David in a minute. I also have one for you, Claire, second. Indoor air quality. How does the UK compare to other countries, briefly, such as those in Europe?
Well, some other countries do have indoor air quality standards. I don't know the details of them, but they do have the standards. But how they're enforced, I don't know. We're sort of like very, very, very new to this indoor air quality stuff here. As I say, the Public Health England have only produced their guidelines in September of last year, and they're the first UK-based guidelines that we've had. So we're just at the beginning, but countries like Finland are really leading it in Europe. And I mean, a lot of the issues, it's not just about the indoor air quality, but it's, I think it was mentioned earlier, about the specification of materials to stop the off-gassing of particularly VOCs. So we're a long way to go. One of the issues that we haven't addressed and haven't talked about is these air purifiers that people seem to be buying. Some of them have been tested and found to be pretty bad for the indoor environment because they
produce free radicals, which are very reactive species, and
Mhm.
it initiates a whole string of chemical reactions indoors that also go on outdoors, which is outdoors, it's initiated by the sun. But it produces a whole lot of pretty horrible chemicals. And I think that issue is something that people are totally unaware of. They just think the word air purifier must be good.
Absolutely, there's a learning curve here. David, then maybe if you want to pick up the whether we're going to have an MVHR. There's also another one here for you. It says a challenge. Tom McGrath says, David, I'm not sure that air has to be filtered. Have you seen that question? It says it completely. There you go. Maybe you'd like to respond to the idea that.
Yeah, I can do it if I can remember two things at a time. But first of all, just to go back to Claire's point, I'm actually married to a Finn, so we go to Helsinki quite a lot, and they are very hot on because they have a heavy focus on the environment anyway. But part of the key to it is, how do you know you've got good air or bad air? And it's actually the canary in the cage. You need a cheap, accurate control system, but monitoring system that tells you there's a problem. And that's not easy, as Claire said, and they're quite expensive. But when we get to a point where there's something that says, hi, I'm over here, there's a problem, then people will start to recognize that there may be a problem. As for MVHR installers, we already have those. They're called electricians. And they bang them in because they've got a PowerPoint, and then they flatten the ductwork and they turn it on, and the fan goes around and job done, job's a good one. Until somebody actually has to produce a commissioning certificate to say, actually, this thing works, then there's a problem. I'll tell you a little story. I bought a new flat about 8 years ago that had MVHR in it. I had the manual. And I bet I was the only one of the 52 people in the apartment who went back to the developer and said, this is not MVHR, mate. This is straightforward extract. And the excuse was that actually they'd given me the wrong manual by mistake.
Okay.
Which then took me back to, so show me your SAP calculation, but that's another whole long story. But that's what you're up against. There should be someone who is competent to install these systems. So absolutely right. As far as the natural ventilation bit goes, you're absolutely right, of course, but it's not as catchy a line, is it, if you say that? The whole joke disappears if you do that. And so my apologies to anybody who does natural ventilation. Of course, there's a place for it. But there is this, I do think there's this kind of perception that it's always the best option. And you see it in cities next to schools trying to put natural ventilation next to busy roads. And I don't think that's a start.
Can I just ask, make a comment about ventilation? We know that particle filters are pretty efficient, especially if they're HEPA filters. What we don't really know is how efficient the NO2 filters that are used when a building is next to a busy road. Tests are done in the laboratory. And one thing I know as an environmental scientist, that whatever you do in the laboratory doesn't quite work in the real environment. The real environment is very much more complex and things are never quite the same. And there have been some studies, but there have not been a lot of studies done. And I think we really need to understand the performance of those NO2 filtration systems better.
I was just going to pick up on that as well, but Jim, if you wouldn't mind.
Sure.
Because the question I think was, Tom, was, well, I'm not sure that air has to be filtered. Well, reflecting on Claire's point, as she just made, we are at a slightly crazy point whereby the regulatory response now to poor local air quality is actually to filter the air coming into buildings. That is where we've got to, and medium to long term, the solution has to be about not making the pollutants in the first place so that you're not filtering them out. So there is some regulatory requirement to filter potentially, and that is because, and the people I'm working with in local boroughs, there are now, this is now a very clear mortality risk. There are people's death certificates now in certain local areas which have local air quality down as the cause of death. So that is why filtration in certain things is probably going to be needed. And it is usually needed on mechanical systems anyway, because you've got to keep the coils clean and the ductwork clean to prevent you actually then having a bigger maintenance problem and potentially mold and a range of things like that. That then links into natural ventilation. Point made, natural ventilation can negate regarding ventilation systems. The running of a fan is not the problem. The running of the fan in terms of energy is a minor consideration. The problem is heating up or cooling the air. That is where the major energy use is coming from. So the low carbon scenario, to take an extreme, for something like a cathedral, where you're not going to be overcladding it with insulation. But a potential low carbon way forward for something like that is to say, we're going back to how this was run in the in medieval times. This is just going to be an ambient temperature, whatever the net impact is indoors, that's going to be the ambient temperature. People respond with clothing, and natural ventilation there is not going to be a problem. However, if we move to any kind of controlled scenario where you want to heat the air or cool the air, the big energy consumption is in that. And the reason to move from natural ventilation to a mechanical ventilation system is you can use your waste air to heat up the incoming air and save a very large amount of energy associated with either heating or cooling the air from other sources. So it's not the fan running, which is really the problem when it comes down to looking at the energy issue.
Jim, if I could just actually in the cathedral option, technology is the answer, because clothing technology has improved massively over the years, and you can get very, very good performing clothing. So actually, just trying to heat a huge cathedral, people to dress appropriately in the season. Yes, so there is a technical answer. Yeah.
The cathedral is a very interesting example, a very interesting thought experiment I've used before, because we're actually in the unusual part now. In a 1,000-year-old historic building, the usual thing has been to use thermal mass to moderately regulate temperature and for people to individually make themselves comfortable. We've moved into, in a relatively small span of this lifetime, a case where people are saying, well, we now need to keep the whole building at a certain temperature for a certain point of time. And we potentially going to have to go back and question that if there's other overriding concerns, things such as historic interest and things of that nature, and really look at that if we are going to solve the big net zero carbon challenge.
And I think I'm just seeing we have a comment coming in as well. Actually, it's clear we could do a whole webinar on cathedrals, it would appear, because Nathan Gamblin's suggesting stratification fans in cathedral. Anyway, that's a discussion for another day. But who knew that is the big topic that we should all be discussing. But on that note, then I'd just like to bring things pretty much to a close. But first off, I was going to ask this stinker of a question, really, for you each. I'm looking for a one-word answer. So this is where I'm just going to ask the key to tackling the indoor climate emergency is. And I'm going to ask you for a one-word answer. I'm going to come to Hugh first, then Claire, and David last. So Hugh, you have the entire vocabulary of the English language to choose from. David, you'll have lost 2 words, so you might need a backup by the time it gets to you. So it's a one-word answer. So we're going to close with a trio of keywords here. So the key to tackling the indoor climate emergency is Hugh.
I'm going to take 2 words because they are carbon dioxide. Singularly, they don't make a sense. That's both in terms of energy and also in terms of control with regards to indoor air quality and environment.
I'm going to say education.
Great. And David? David happens to be on mute.
Muted myself, isn't it? You need to, so the word is care. You need to care about it.
Excellent. So carbon dioxide, education, and care. Those are 3 interesting words for us to finish on, to take away from today's session. So in closing, big thank you to each of you, David, Claire, and Hugh, to your virtual audience for their questions and comments. Reminder to check out Elemental, www.elementalexpo.com, the online community for professionals focused on innovation in heat, water, air, and energy within the built environment. You'll find there the full diary of events on the website, 3 more webinars in this series, many more besides. In case you missed it, there's a back catalogue of recent sessions all available to watch on demand at your leisure with your chocolates and a glass of something you choose in the evening rather than TV box sets. So it's all there for you. That's it for today. I've been Jim McClelland, editor at Susmin. Thanks for watching. See you again soon. Thank you very much, everybody.